What's up, Street Talks? This is Eric from the Eric Street Photography blog. So, just wanted to make a quick video on some practical tips on how to make a great street photograph. So, if you're watching this video, I assume street photography is something you're interested in, is your passion, or something you've kind of heard about and you just want to get better at it. So, based on my personal experiences, here are some practical tips on how to make a great street photograph. So, tip number one, gestures. Often, when it comes to shooting street photography, the beginners like myself, when I started off, we're just going to photograph people who are just kind of walking by and they're not really doing anything. I think what makes a great street photograph first is composition, and the second is emotion. Composition is you think about the leading lines, shooting from a lower perspective, trying to integrate triangles, depth in your photographs, not having distracting backgrounds. And emotion is a photograph that hits you in the heart, a photograph that makes you laugh, cry, helps you empathize with the subject of a photograph. But in order to capture emotions in a photograph, especially in street photography, it's one of the most difficult things. A practical tip I have is look for gestures, because humans are very nonverbal creatures, because we could say one thing, but our body language shows something else. For example, if you're talking to somebody and you say, oh, hey, I love you, and your voice is just kind of like that and you're not doing anything with your body, you're not really going to get that sort of emotion. Whereas somebody not necessarily might not say that they love you, but by giving you a hug, giving you a smile, a big kiss, whatever like that, or just showing some sort of body language or gesture which makes you feel open, it's probably going to be a lot more effective. Similarly, in street photography, if you want to capture an amazing photograph, try to capture gestures. So one practical tip is either when I'm walking on the streets, I try not to photograph people just with their hands down. I try to wait for them to do something with their hands. So for example, they're walking down the street, they're covering up their eyes from the sun. If there was somebody else, the second they hug them, kiss them, hold somebody, gives you a thumbs up, or in this case, someone gives you the jazz hands. The story behind this photograph is when I saw this lady walking down Hollywood. First of all, I have a thing with old ladies in hats. Don't ask me why. And at the time, I had a Canon 5D, 35. No, this was actually 24 millimeter lens, an off-camera flash. And the second I saw her, I thought she looked like an interesting character. I crouched down, and the second I was about to take a photograph, she saw me about to take a photograph, put up her hands, gave me the little jazz hands as an interesting gesture, and then captured the moment. What I personally like about the shot is I love the eye contact, her hat, the light coming from behind her head. Because I used the flash, I was able to fill in her face. I like her mismatched earrings, I like her hand gesture, and I like her little posse, the man on the right and the woman on the left. And so when you're out shooting street photography, sometimes making it obvious that you're shooting somebody and not being invisible could also help you make a better street photograph. The reason being is if you shoot 100% candid, and let's say a person just walking, you might not get an interesting hand gesture. But sometimes interacting with your subject, asking for permission, you could get some sort of gesture, either with the hands, the face, the body. It can make the photograph much more engaging, lively, and hopefully capture some more emotions. Tip number two, look for details. When I started off in street photography, I was just capture the entire scene, as the person's face, their body, their legs, whatever's in the background. The problem with this is the more general you make the street photograph, the more kind of uninteresting it is. I think rather try to do the opposite, is focus on one specific detail of a person or a scene that you find interesting and eliminate everything else. For example, in this photograph, I was walking around downtown LA in the fashion district. I see this woman with these amazing fingernails. And yeah, just in case you're curious, those are actually real. Though the way you know is that the fingers are actually curved. So first I wanted to take a photo of her entire body. And I was about to take a photo and she kind of freaks out. She said, oh, what are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. And sometimes when life gives you lemons, you can make lemonade. So what I said instead was, oh, sorry to have scared you, ma'am. Oh, do you mind, instead of photographing your face, if I could just photograph your hands and your fingernails? And she said, yeah. So I shot a photo with a flash of her hands and her nails. And I think it made a much more interesting photograph because by showing only the details, it makes the rest of the scene a little more mysterious. And it allows the viewer to kind of fill in the blanks. And Another problem with a lot of street photos I see is the photographer is showing too much to the viewer, and the viewer is not exactly sure what to focus on. And so, as a practical tip, just photographing just hands, details, someone's face, their eyes, just the shoes, just maybe their midsection. By showing more, you show less. By showing less, you show more. Okay. Sorry, I'm like really caffeinated. I just had a cold brew. All right. Tip number 3, perspective. So there's lots of different ways you can integrate better perspective in your street photography. Either you could shoot from a very, very low angle looking up, which makes your subjects look bigger than life. They often call this the Superman effect. Another tip is sometimes people are really high up shooting looking down. So climbing on top of a ladder or going on top of the tall building looking down. What you just want to try to avoid is just the ordinary perspective. An ordinary perspective is you just walking and just taking photos at eye level. Try to get either really low or really high. Even some street photographers, what they'll do is they'll put their camera literally on the ground and shoot up. If your camera has an LCD screen, especially now the new digital cameras, they have the articulating tilt screens. That helps a lot. For this photograph, I was shooting downtown LA near the Fashion District. See this guy in this cool lowrider bike, and I crouch down with a flash, and I don't really remember the story behind this photograph, but I think I said something along the lines of, "Oh, you look pretty badass, love your tattoos," and I might have taken one or two photographs. And what I love about the low perspective is that it makes the handlebars look really, really big, and also it creates a nice little triangle composition in between his hands, the bottom of his handlebars, and the top right corner. And also I like his little gesture with his hand and the tattoos on his elbow. And you can also see, because I shot a flash, it helps pop him out from the background. So when you're out shooting street photography, often embracing a low perspective makes the subject look bigger, more interesting. But when you're up shooting really high, looking down from that perspective, it also makes it interesting because people look tiny like ants. I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, but try to integrate mystery into your street photos. I think the best street photos are the ones where the viewer is able to come up with his or her own story. So there's generally 2 different types of photographs. There's open photographs and closed photographs. Open photographs are photos that are open to interpretation, where the viewer makes up his or her own story. In general, these photos are much more memorable. A closed photograph is a photograph in which you photograph what something is. So if you just photographed a Coca-Cola can, it is what it is. There's no other way to interpret it. Generally, open photos are much more interesting, engaging, because it allows for more mystery in the photograph. Whenever we watch a movie, we hate it when people spoil the ending before we watch it. We like to have a sense of suspense and mystery. And so, for example, in this photograph, the viewer will look at this photograph, and the first thing the viewer might think is, wow, that's kind of weird. His hand looks pretty gnarly, or something like that. But in reality, it's actually not his hand. It's the hand of his partner. And so I think it makes the photograph a little bit more mysterious. When you're out shooting, rather than shoving everything in the frame, think about what you could leave out of the frame. And the more mystery you add to the scene, the more interest and intrigue you'll give to your viewer. Tip number 5, juxtaposition. So this is a pretty standard tip in street photography, is to capture a juxtaposition. For those of you guys who don't know the word juxtaposition, essentially it's like this fancy art school way of saying contrast. Generally, a juxtaposition is having 2 different elements or 2 different things, which are either similar or dissimilar in some sort of unique way. So for example, in this photograph, I was just shooting and I see this mannequin on the left side and there's a security guard on the right side. I just took a few photographs and waited for the security guard on the right to look at me. And at this moment, it looks like the mannequin and the security guard on the right are both looking at me. And the juxtaposition is that you have a mannequin who's obviously not real, but also is feminine. And then you have the real man on the right side who's obviously real, but also a man. So there's a juxtaposition in the sense that they're both looking the same way, but one is real, one is fake. And there's lots of different ways you could do this in street photography. For example, photographing someone who's really tall next to someone who's really short. Photographing somebody who's really old next to somebody who's very young. Photographing someone who's fat next to someone who's really skinny. Other ways you could do this, you could juxtapose different shapes. Circles next to triangles. You could put horizontal lines next to vertical lines. You could photograph people with darker complexions next to lighter complexions, or juxtapose different colors, like the color red against the color blue, warm tones against cold tones, warm tones being colors red, orange, yellow, against colder tones, which tend to be blue, green, purple. So there's lots of different ways you could create juxtaposition in street photography, but when you're doing it, try to make it, how do I say this? Rather than just try to make photos that are typically just jokey photos. So a classic example is you find a billboard in the background with a finger sticking out, and you wait for somebody to walk by. It looks like the finger's touching them in the forehead. That's good enough, but it's already been like done a million times. Think about ways you could juxtapose emotions. So sad people next to happy people, rich people next to poor people, and so forth. Eyes are the windows to the soul. When it comes to me, there's nothing I love more than photos with strong eye contact, because if I see a photograph with strong eye contact, it looks like the subject in the frame is looking directly at me, the viewer. And if you've ever had an instance when you're walking around in public or you're sitting on the bus or in an elevator and someone's making eye contact with you, it's actually very disconcerting, and it kind of makes you feel nervous, a little bit afraid, kind of gets your heart rate up. So generally when you're out shooting street photography, if you want to make photos that are much more engaging, try to capture eye contact. There's different ways you could do this. Is you could photograph people and keep clicking until they see you, and then they make eye contact with you, and then you capture the shot. Another way you could do this is by maybe taking photos of people looking at other photos where the eye contact is very strong. Or if you're shooting a street portrait where you're asking for permission, stop somebody on the street, compliment them, ask if you can make a portrait of them. And usually when they say, yeah, sure, what do you want me to do? Say the two things. One, don't smile, and two, just look straight into the lens. And you generally get much more genuine photos. And that's actually a tip I learned from photographer Martin Parr. So yeah, think about other ways you could integrate eyes to your photograph. Another way I was able to make in this shot was, saw a guy in downtown LA, saw this nice little narrow strip of light over his eye, and I shot this on a digital Ricoh GR2 camera. Was in P mode, ISO 1600 I think, and I set the exposure compensation to -1 2/3 perhaps, and what that did was it highlights his eye but totally darkens out the background. So I just kept clicking, got closer and closer. Then he makes eye contact with me, and he doesn't move and he doesn't really care. So I took about like 15 more shots, and he's just talking on the phone. So try to get eyes and remember the saying. Last tip, the cherry on top. If you're an American like me, one of the most delicious desserts we have is something called an ice cream sundae. It's a huge, container full of ice cream on the bottom. Then usually you have bananas in the center. You have some whipped cream, more ice cream, with some chocolate, some almond sprinkles, and on the top you have a little cherry on top. An ice cream sundae is not an ice cream sundae without the cherry on top. And whenever I'm looking at photographs, whether they be mine or other people's photographs, I'm always looking for the cherry on top. The cherry on top is a tiny little detail which turns a good street photograph into a great street photograph. So for this photograph, what do you think is the cherry on top? Yep, you guessed it, you smarty pants you. It's the little Pinocchio nose of the lady in the background. And if you guys are curious, the way the nose was, the reason why the nose looks so long is because it was shot on an angled wall, which made the nose look longer, and it was also shot during golden hour, during sunset, where the shadows tend to get longer. And so I think that's what makes the photograph unique, because there's a strong symbolism of Pinocchio. And usually when you think about Pinocchio, long nose, it's, somebody's lying. And so perhaps this lady is lying about something. And I'm not 100% sure what that might be, but once again, leaving the photo open-ended allows the viewer to make up his or her own story about a photograph, which makes it more interesting. So this is also another tip, is if you want to make a more interesting photograph, don't make a caption which gives away the story. Generally, what I suggest is just to put the city or the location and just the date. So Los Angeles 2016, or Rome 2016, or Chicago 2016, whatever it may be. And so when it comes to the cherry on top, often when you're shooting in the streets, you're not going to immediately see the cherry on top, But this tip is really important when it comes to editing, choosing your best street photographs, or choosing, let's say you take 20 photos of a scene, look for the cherry on top in one of the photographs as a criterion of whether you want to keep the photograph or not. And you're not always going to get a cherry on top. There's lots of photos where you make really good photos, but it's not a great photograph because there's not a small little detail. Another tip is if you buy photo books or look at photos from the masters, generally some of the best photos in history just have one small detail, which is a cherry on top. Sometimes it's in the background, it's in the edges of the frame. So when you guys are looking at photos, the tendency is to look at what's in the inner 30-50% of the frame. My suggestion is start from the background, start from the edges of the frame, and go around the edges, the background of the frame, and keep spiraling in until you get to the center of the frame at the very end. This way allows you to search for the cherry on top or the small detail, which makes the photograph great, and allows you to appreciate what makes a great street photograph. So these are just 7 small quick tips in terms of determining what makes a great street photograph. Of course, this is not a 100% inclusive list, meaning there's lots of other things which make great street photograph, but I think these are small tips which could help you in your personal journey when it comes to choosing your best street photographs. So let's say you have 1,000 photos in Lightroom after a day of shooting. Use these kind of tips to determine whether you want to keep a shot or ditch a shot. And the more you start to study your photos, dissect them afterwards, the more you can learn. And these things become intuitive and instinctive over time. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching, guys. I'll include more tips in future videos. And until then, keep hitting the streets. Peace out.